Welcome everyone joining us for webinar number 172 since the Andean Health Organization started the webinar series in May 2020. COVID-19 pandemic also teaches us that the capacities built and strengthened in these 3 years should not be rolled back. And health should continue to be at the center of policies. Research, epidemiological and genomic surveillance, vaccine and drug development, and the deployment of health promotion and prevention measures are essential for a caring society. Reflections on these and other priorities relevant to health and well-being can be found in the monthly Notisalud Andina newsletter available on the Andean Health Organization's website. We invite you to leave your name, organization, and country in the comment box of the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chat. In the same space, you can leave questions or send them via email to webinarhorasconu@gmail.com. In this webinar, we will follow the usual dynamics. We will start with institutional greeting, followed by the presentations of our speakers, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. To access the certificate of attendance as usual, in any of the chats of Facebook Live or YouTube Live, you will find a fixed link where you must fill out a brief survey and leave your data as email. Please verify that your email is correctly written for sending the certificate, which will be sent in the coming days to your mails. To begin this important day, I give the floor to Dr. Marisela Malki, Deputy Secretary of the Andean Health Organization, who will give the welcome and institutional greeting. Go ahead, Dr. Malki. Thank you, Rudy. Morning and good afternoon. Welcome, webinar number 172 of the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unánue Agreement or CONU, in which we address a multidimensional problem that disproportionately threatens girls, boys, adolescents, and women in our region. In Latin America, disappearances of people continue to occur, including, with a constant increase, cases of girls, adolescents, and women kidnapped by human trafficking and sexual exploitation networks. Mexico is one of the countries with the highest number of disappearances, including 25,000 missing persons, 20% of whom were under the age of 18 when they were reported missing. The data show that similar cases continue to increase, with drug trafficking and organized crime networks as the main cultural agent. It is estimated that 6 girls, adolescents, and women disappear daily in the country. In the Andean region, the situation is not the opposite. Colombia's National Registry of Missing Persons counted a total of 12,966 missing women up to 2022, of which 28.72% were girls, adolescents, and young women. Likewise, in Peru, according to figures from the National Registry of Information of Missing Persons, the RENIPED, 6,266 missing persons have been registered in the last 5 years, of which 61,941, that is 63% were women. Of this number, 87% were female adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. Other countries with a worrying increase in cases of missing women are Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. There is practically no country in the region that is not struggling with the phenomenon of disappearance of women, children, and adolescents. According to the OAS, and as previously expressed in the case of Mexico, disappearances of women are often linked to other forms of gender violence, such as sexual violence, trafficking, or feminicide. And in some countries, they're also linked to organized groups. These data reflect the urgency of strengthening intersectoral and normative framework, improvement of gender statistics in the region, and particularly the measurement of gender-based violence against women and girls and its extreme forms and harmful practice. In addition, sufficient and sustainable budgets are required to guarantee systematic progress in the implementation of special or comprehensive laws on the prevention and eradication of gender-based violence against women and girls and its extreme forms. And therefore, for the strengthening of national information systems and their statistical. On the other hand, it is imperative to recognize the need to educate about social justice, understood as the application of the principles of human dignity, the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity, the universal destination of goods, and the value of human work, with the aim of inclining man to create certain conditions necessary his own fulfillment and that of others in our community. This is the only way to influence at the individual, local, national, or global level the exercise of human rights, such as life, liberty, integrity, and dignity, which are violated in human trafficking. Today's webinar, part of our strategic line, Rights, Children, and Adolescents, which was strengthened in Horas Coño since April 2020, based on the recognition of the high vulnerability of these age groups and its inexorable increase in the context of pandemic and multi-systemic crisis. The objective of today's event is to present the current situation on the problems of disappearance and trafficking of children, adolescents, and women in the Andean region, including successful experiences in addressing the problem from the perspective of prevention, early action, and protection of survivors. To this end, we have had the participation of nationally and internationally recognized speakers, such as Guillermo Zeta, Rocío Rosero, Ariadna Reyes, and Johnny Maita, to whom we are very grateful for participating in this important interlearning. This is the beginning of a series of dialogues needed in our region to raise awareness and promote international cooperation, to agree on common and comprehensive lines of actions to respond more successfully to current and potential challenges in this area. Once again, welcome all the people from Latin America and other continents who join us every week in the webinar. We reiterate our gratitude and warmest welcome to the speakers who join us today. Thank you. Go ahead, Ruby. Thank you very much, dear Dr. Malki. After the greeting of our Deputy Secretary, I introduce myself. My name is Rui Diaz, a public health and global health professional who participates in the action line for the rights of children and adolescents in the Andean Health Organization. Today, with great pleasure, I will be in charge of moderating the first part of this webinar. After this preamble, we welcome Gilberto Zuleta Ibarra. Gilberto Zuleta is a lawyer with specialization in administrative law, has a master's degree in human rights and democratization, and studies in public policy and gender and international relations. As an international accreditation in criminal profiling for sexual crimes. He served as Deputy Director of the Public Prosecutor's Office, Defense and Promotion of Human Rights of the Municipal Personería of Santiago de Cali and in the University of Colombia. He has more than 9 years of experience within the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, on issues of trafficking of persons, smuggling of migrants, migration and gender, developing actions to strengthen the response of the authorities in the identification, referral, investigation, and prosecution of crime, well as local, national, and regional diagnostic documents covering countries such as Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, and Jordan. He is currently the regional officer for the UNODC Track for TIP initiative, which is the United Nations Office Against Crime and Drugs, with the objective of strengthening the response in cases of human trafficking in the migration countries of the region, specifically in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Dominican Republic, Aruba, Trinidad and Tobago, and Curacao. Go ahead, dear Gilberto Zuleta, you have the floor. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ruby, for the introduction and for your introduction words, Dr. Stella. And I would also like to greet the panel at such high level. I'm going to start sharing my presentation that I have prepared for today. And once again, we thank the Andean Health Organization for this invitation that recognizes the importance they give to this topic that's so delicate, that is increasingly growing in the region, especially with the last phenomena. And they have asked me that this in a few minutes I can share about the importance of the public-private partnerships to combat and prevent human trafficking based on the document prepared by our office, the United Nations Office Against Drug and Crime, thanks to the government of Germany, where we generate a compendium of promising practices to combat the crime of human trafficking from the perspective of the public-private partnership. But before looking at this document, I would like to mention some context and some insights of what we can be experiences in this region and why we have a background of the importance of having this type of partnerships, public and private partnerships for human trafficking. First, we must recognize that we are dealing migrations, massive migrations and displacement throughout the world. Many of them are caused by internal conflicts, by international conflicts, but at the same time by other factors such as climate change. The fact that we have natural disaster, overflow of rivers, and makes that many families must be displaced and they lose their crops in rural areas and depend on this subsistence media, which generates displacement. In addition, humankind, as it has been mentioned in the opening words, just recovering, if we can say it this way, to an episode of a world episode such as the COVID-19 pandemic, that not only generated a losses of life, but also affected the health of many people throughout the world, but also generate a socioeconomic impact. And this socioeconomic impact that following the Second World War, we haven't seen an impact of this level in the economic life of people, social life of people. And also has affected us because it has stopped, and in some cases has made us go forward to comply a 2030 agenda that was established with specific goals to obtain what we can call the Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, we are suffering a period in our history quite agitated with complex situations. And all this preamble leads us to mention that all these factors, perhaps from a light view, could not have any effect on human trafficking, but it's actually the opposite. Climate change, forced displacement, and massive migrations, socioeconomic crisis generated by the pandemic such as COVID-19 have a direct impact in the presentation of crime such as human trafficking, a crime that's extremely serious and complex, and it's a manifestation of organized crime throughout the world. In our region of Latin America and the Caribbean, we are not, unfortunately, it's present in our regions, affects women throughout the world, and given its complexity and the context in which it occurs, and thanks to some conditions and circumstances of vulnerability that traffickers in the world and in our region take advantage and abuse that vulnerability situation to obtain economic gains against the rights and the guarantee of boys, girls, adolescents, and in women. So for our office in recent years, and also acknowledging that there's issues throughout the world where we recognize the need to strengthen the fight against this crime, in addition to have other sectors involved, such as public-private partnerships, that we start to generate some declarations at the international level about the importance of approaching this type of partnerships and finding this partnership some strategies to combat crime, but also prevent it and work hand in hand or to contribute with the authorities of the criminal justice to fight against this in terms of guaranteeing justice and fight impunity. Just to mention some of the context in the Kyoto Declaration in 2021, we recognize the importance of the type of partnerships, in particular to prevent all forms of crime. Also through working groups from the United Nations Convention, the UNODC, which we have our office, the United Nations Office Against Drugs and Crime, indicate the key role of private sector and civil society and the academics to coordinate efforts trying to prevent human traffic through partnership with authorities from the public sector. And the working groups that have their office in Vienna recognize that this is sector that in terms of technology plays a fundamental role in this crime, and also mentioning the importance that we have around all the process associated to the supply chain and the process of purchases and acquisitions that the private sector and the financial and technology sector. Gilberto, our apologies. Are you showing the slides? No, I'm not. I haven't started with my slides. After this preamble and some reflections and context, so we can go into matter and start with my presentation. So I would like to tell you that a few years ago, our office, with the support of the government of Germany, drafted this guideline. This guide is called the Promote Promising Practices to Prevent and Combat Human Trafficking in Terms of Public-Private Partnerships. This guide has two objectives, which I would like to mention briefly before sharing the content of this guide. The first is to promote the involvement of the private sector in the implementation of the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, and in particular in the protocol against trafficking in persons, mostly girls and women, known as Palermo Protocol. But it has also an additional objective, which is strengthening the effective public-private partnerships to combat trafficking in persons. Why do we have these goals? I mentioned the context at the beginning, a rather complex crime, things that are affecting the world with socioeconomic crisis generated by the pandemic and climate change and migrations and massive displacement in our region, and that from this complexity, they require a strong response in our office. With the fighting against the transnational organized crime and the protocol against trafficking in person, we wanted to generate this guide to show good practices, but not only that, but implement that example of good practices with some tips and recommendations in order to promote them and strengthen them. Methodology used to build this guide was a very nourished methodology based mostly in expert meetings carried out in different regions, plus bilateral inquiries. In these expert meetings, the government worked, the private sector worked, and also the civil society, the academic area, and other stakeholders have shared their experiences. In that regard, through these spaces, as you can see, where we consider experiences in Eastern Europe, the Americas, South America, Central America, Asia Pacific, and Africa, we were able to collect 39 promising practices, good practices where we could collect all these experiences of public-private partnerships that allow or facilitate the fight against human trafficking throughout the world. Fortunately, due to time limitations, I cannot detail those 39 promising practice. I will mention some general, but the document is available for all of you for referral if you're interested. Of these 39 promising practices, we were also able, through this exercise, rescue, as I mentioned, only the example of promising practices. We also had a structure where we had some tips or recommendations on these practices and what lessons learned had these practices left us to correct some identified errors, like in any other process that requires constant review. And also, you're going to find key information about human trafficking, context on human trafficking that exists in this situation. Initial portion of this guide tells us about the introduction, more in detail about the reflections that I gave at the beginning. I talk about why public-private partnerships have a relationship between human trafficking fight, and they are approaching the importance of a relationship between human trafficking and the private sector. As we're going to see in a few minutes, the document deals about three key sectors. The supply chain, we're talking about those sectors of the economy where different elements of manufacture, goods and services distribution, where the public sector that is linked to this type of activities is extremely important to combat and prevent human trafficking, not only in terms of labor exploitation only. And the second sector has to do with the financial sector, how the financial sector understands that this private sector has a fundamental role in fighting crime. And in addition, the third sector that has direct relationship with the technological sector. In this first part, what we are trying to achieve is to expose how to maximize public-private partnerships to strengthen the response to a complex crime and the challenges that emerge over and over in this area. As an example, perhaps 15, 20 years ago, to talk about human trafficking and climate change was not something that we could talk directly. Today, following the impacts in displacement generated by climate change, we can recognize how indeed there is a vulnerability situation that gets worse and may generate an increase in human trafficking. The same technology that was humankind has also been taken advantage by these criminals to commit their crimes. So in this part, what we do is to find a context framework of why we need to celebrate this type of partnerships, and they are key to develop a strategic fight against human trafficking. A second part, as I mentioned, talks about the PPPs and supply chain. And the document starts with a conceptual portion where they generate that understanding of the relationship between supply chains and human trafficking, not only as labor exploitation or children employment, and understanding a link and fundamental role to identify that in the supply chains we can have this crime. Therefore, the document also talks about the importance of the interdisciplinarity to recognize how not only is the responsibility of the authorities because of the legal mandates and constitutional mandates and the role as public authorities, but not only involve them, but also involve stakeholders in the supply chain in order to detect practices and prevent human trafficking. In addition, we rescue the importance to have local partners. How these partnerships should be based on these local partners, which basically need to be translated in our environment as our key stakeholders at the community level. Communities play an important role to protective environments or to configure protective environments, and by linking local partners, civil society, academic, and the private sector, this needs to build a protective environment for boys, girls, men, and women that may be at risk of human trafficking. Finally, in this second part of the supply chains is the importance of the collection of information, to have updated information from the private sector in order to understand what are the new dynamics that exist. If we look today in our region, where many countries, areas in South America and the Caribbean, we could deepen in the fishery industry, and we can find some information that will generate alerts about what may be occurring in this sector, especially when there's a massive migration flow, when at this moment we have boys, girls, and adolescents migrating on their own, and that may be at risk of human trafficking. Another point with this document, and this importance in all the purchases, outsourcing, and recruitment from the private sector, we have standards that will allow a transparency about how through recruitment and outsourcing in the private sector, we can guarantee that those who are being outsourced or recruited in the private sector are not do not fall in practices that violate rights and specifically human trafficking as a commitment of the private sector in the standardization of the process. And finally, communication should be assertive and clear in all partners who are playing a role as local partners. Then we have the third part, which involves the second sector that I mentioned, which are the PPPs in the financial sector. And here, perhaps many people who ask themselves, what is the role of the financial sector in preventing and fighting against human trafficking? And the answer is based on the financial sector plays a role from compliance in detecting the money laundering resulting from human trafficking. Let's remember that human trafficking is exploitation for an economic benefit. That economic benefit, as part of the criminal chain, goes to a point where it should need to be laundry, with money laundering. And in that regard, if the financial sector is involved from a high-level leadership, the highest executives, in generating a commitment inside their sector that can fight or at least generate strategies to fight and identify this flow of money that results from the illicit market of human trafficking, and is going to help to identify those responsible by sharing information with authority. But this is quite a challenge, and it's one of the recommendations. We need to generate knowledge through training and understanding the typologies about these human phenomena. And this implies that we can take to the financial sector information about human trafficking and create tools. I'm going to tell you about a practice that's not included in the document, but is fresh in my memory. It was recent in Colombia, where with the Bank Association in Colombia, our office developed a handbook to identify typologies of human trafficking and where they could be involved with money laundering, to take to compliance officers with this document that will allow them to identify when the capital inflow of certain people may be linked with the human trafficking crime. And here we mention key elements such as the importance in the use of technology to detect this type of movement, and the monitoring and evaluation, and they can share with the authorities to report. And something that needs to be recognized is that there is a risk of privacy and also human rights, because we know that in the financial system there's a regulation to consider privacy of the holders of bank accounts. So how do we deal with these strategies? Well, from certain recommendations. Finally, we mentioned the PPPs and the technology sector. Because we mentioned at the beginning how today, due to the context of COVID-19, much of our life, or all of our life, and virtual. And going on virtuality, the social gaps also were affected. In real life, we found children in rural areas who didn't have access to good quality education. When we moved to elementary education to virtual classes, we found these same children in rural areas with no access to internet didn't have the same access to education. There would be an education gap. That was, but thinking the criminal structures went on to the virtuality and were able to take this human trafficking by using technology. That is why the technology sector plays a fundamental role in the identification of situations that may result in human trafficking of boys and girls, but also tools that can facilitate victims their claim and report to the authorities. We have designed several ways of anonymous reports, panic buttons that do georeference of the victim. Here, the document insists in something important. Any strategy that is approached from the technology sector should have a victim-centered approach and guarantee that the victims are heard, so so there's a response to the reality. We cannot continue building tools from the capital cities so far away from the reality of how these things are occurring, such as human trafficking. We need to listen to the victims of these tools and strategies respond to the reality. And here we have to consider data ethics, guarantee anonymity of the victims, guarantee that by sharing information with the authorities, these, these applications not re-victimizing those who suffered, have reported or used these tools. Finally, it's always key to consider innovation. The crime networks are constantly innovating their criminal methods. So the response by the authorities and the PPP should always look for innovation in this regard. This document concludes with some key messages, tips on how to promote these private-public partnerships, lessons learned, and some data that are relevant about the human trafficking that nourish from the promising practices identified in these regions of the world, which are 39 in total. Finally, we conclude in this document that the increased information exchange between sectors and regions is very important in the technology because human trafficking occurs transnationally, and it's important to learn what are happening in the regions in order to provide a comprehensive response. Secondly, there's an urgent need to orient actions towards the victims. We cannot have listen to the victim's voice and to acknowledge their experiences. Effective response will be based on the victim's experience. Third, technology plays a fundamental role in combating trafficking. As we've seen how COVID-19 turned to the virtual world and how technology that is moving very fast should also be a partner to identify this case. Finally, what the document is to mention how our Office Against Drugs and Crime plays a key role as facilitator in these public-private partnerships through the trust and experience in our presence in the offices throughout the world that we have in the region, and how we can, from our role as keepers of this protocol, fight or facilitate the fight against this crime and promoting public-private alliances. With this, I finish. I hope I kept time, and I'm at your disposal for any question and also waiting for the other
Muchas gracias,
presentation.
estimado Gilberto
Thank you,
Zuleta.
dear Gilberto
El
Zuleta.
experto nos comentó
The expert
inicialmente sobre
comment
el
about
contexto de
the
vulnerabilidad
context
de
of
las
vulnerability
personas, el
for
fenómeno
human
de
trafficking that includes
desplazamientos forzados
masses of
y
forced
migraciones
displacements
masivas por conflictos
and migrations
internos
due to
se
internal
complica y que los
conflicts, economic crisis, and climate
los
change
cuales han sido exacerbados
that have been
por la
exacerbated
pandemia de
by the
COVID-19.
COVID-19 pandemic.
Frente a esta situación, se cuenta con un
We
documento
have
importante a
an
nivel
important document
internacional, el
at
cual
the
se
international
denomina
level,
Buenas
which is
Prácticas
the
Público-Privadas para
Public-Private Good
Prevenir y
Practices
Combatir
Guide to
la Trata
Prevent
de
and Combat
Personas, que
Human
tiene
Trafficking.
como objetivos
with goals
fomentar la vinculación
promoting
entre
the
sector
involvement of the
privado y la
private sector
implementación de
in
la
the
Convención
implementation of the
ONU
UN
contra la
Convention
Delincuencia
Against
Organizada Transnacional
Transnational Organized
y el
Crime
Protocolo
and
contra
the
la Trata de
Protocol
Personas,
Against Trafficking in
además de
Human Trafficking.
tener como segundo objetivo
Also,
el de
as a second
fortalecer
objective,
alianzas
strengthening effective
público-privadas
public-private
efectivas para
partnerships
combatir
to
la trata
combat
de personas.
trafficking in persons.
Gilberto Zuleta nos mencionó
Gilberto
algunos
Zuleta
actores
mentioned some
clave para estas
key
asociaciones
stakeholders
público-privadas,
for these
que son los sectores
PPPs,
participantes
which
en las
are
tareas
those
de su
who participate
implementación,
in the
el
supply
sector
chain,
financiero,
financial
el sector de
sector,
la tecnología,
the technology
además de
sector,
las comunidades, sociedad
in
civil y
addition to the
académica,
community, civil
como
society, and
ejemplos
academic. It showed
importantísimos
us important
para
examples
tener en cuenta en cada
to
uno de
take
estos
into
sectores.
consideration each one of these sectors.
Asimismo, indicó que es
He also
imposible
indicated
lograr
that it's
alianzas sin
impossible to
comprender la
achieve
relación
partnerships
directa
without understanding
de estos
the
sectores con la
relationships of these
problemática
sectors
en los territorios de
with this
interés.
problem
Por
in the
ello, son
territories of
fundamentales las
interest.
investigaciones
Therefore,
y
we
diseño
need
de intervenciones
the design
interdisciplinarias
of
y
interdisciplinary
transdisciplinarias.
interventions and transdisciplinary interventions.
Esto, a su vez, depende de
And
los
this
vínculos
also
de
depends
comunicación con
on the
todos los sectores
communication
de
link
interés.
between all the
Nuevamente
stakeholders.
agradecemos
Once
su
again, we
participación,
thank for
Gilberto
your
Zuleta, y
participation,
esperemos que
Gilberto
nos pueda
Zuleta.
acompañar hasta el final del
Please
webinar,
stay until the end of the
que
webinar.
incluye la
It
participación en la sección
includes
de preguntas y
your
respuestas.
participation in the Q&A session.
Ahora le damos la más
Now,
cordial
we
bienvenida
give
a
a warm welcome
Ariadna
to
Reyes,
Ariadna Reyes,
quien es
who
feminista
is
Ecuatoriana,
Colombian Ecuadorian
miembro del
feminist,
movimiento social
member
de
of the
mujeres
women's social
feministas
movement
en
and
Ecuador.
feminists from
Es
Ecuador.
defensora de
She is
derechos
a human
humanos e
rights
investigadora
defender and
contradictoria
researcher
en la
with
formulación
experience in
y
the
diseño
formulation and
de
design
políticas
of
públicas
public
de
policies
igualdad
for
entre mujeres
equality
y
between
hombres
women and men,
y para el ejercicio
for
de
the
los derechos
exercise
de
of the
niñas,
rights
niños y
of boys,
adolescentes
girls, and
a nivel
adolescents at
nacional y
subnational
nacional.
and national levels.
Ha acompañado las
Thus
luchas de diversos
accompany the
movimientos
struggles of
sociales
various
y
social movements
asesorado en la
and advise
investigación
on
especializada
specialized research
de los
on
delitos de
crimes of
movilidad
human
humana,
mobility,
trata de
human
personas,
trafficking,
de diversas
various
formas de
forms of
explotación
exploitation,
y
and
de violencia
gender-based
basada en género.
violence.
Estimada,
Dear
estimada Ariadna, el
Ariadna,
espacio es todo suyo,
you have the
eh,
space
y bienvenida.
and welcome.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Ruby.
you very much,
Un
Ruby.
agradecimiento al organismo andino
My thanks to the
Regional
Andean Health Organization,
por
Dr.
sus palabras
Cela,
iniciales
for their
desde
opening
la
words
perspectiva
that
de
from the
lo que
perspective
voy a poner en
of what I'm
común.
going to present,
Resulta absolutamente
it is
necesario
absolutely
para ello.
important as an
Con la doctora
introduction.
Rocío Rosero, que
With
no
Dr.
pudo
Rocio
acompañarnos
Rosero,
hoy,
who's not with us today,
colaboramos en un
we
estudio
work in
de
a
iniciativas
study
políticas
of the
de la región
Spotlight
centroamericana
initiative
latina
in the Latin
y
American Regional
señalamos
Program
otro
that
poderoso
has
reto
other
en torno
centered
a la
see the
prevención y
importance of data for
erradicación
the
de
prevention and
mujeres
eradication of
y
violence
niñas.
against women and girls.
Y bueno, agradezco
And
además
I thank
al comité asesor de
the
este
advisor
estudio
committee of
multidimensional
the
y el marco
multidimensional
que
studies
tiene
that
que ver
under the
coordinado
frame
con el programa de las
of
Naciones
this
Unidas para la
Spotlight
Desarrollo,
initiative in the UNDP,
lograron hacer los estudios
we were
multidimensionales
able to do these
en materia de
multidimensional
feminicide.
studies
Y Rocío
of
y yo tuvimos
feminicide and
la
femicide.
suerte de trabajar
And we were able to
con
work
esto en
with
qué está pasando
that what
con la
is going
generación de los
on
datos
with the
estadísticos.
data, the generation of
Este
statistical data.
experimento en 10
This study
países,
was carried out in 10
países de
countries,
Centroamérica, países
Central
de la
America,
región andina
in
y
the
en el
Andean
South
region, and in the South
Cone.
Cone.
Nuestra principal
And
inspiración
our most
con
important
Rocío fue
inspiration with Rocio
la recomendación
was
general número 2 del MESTECBI
the
de
mistake,
seguimiento a la
general
aplicación
recommendation
de la
number 2
Convención Belén do Pará,
following
que ya en
this
el año
convention. So
2018
in 2018,
estaba alertando a los
it was
países de
alerting countries
emergencia de la
about the
relación de
emergence of the
desapariciones
relationship of
de
disappearances
adolescentes y
of
mujeres
girls and
y
adolescents
la
and
violencia
women
contra la mujer
and
basada en
violence
género.
against the
Para el
gender-based violence
estudio
against
y
women.
nosotras
For the
trabajamos
study that we
y
worked
colaboramos con Rocío,
and collaborated with
analizamos una
Rocio,
serie de
we
categorías
analyzed a number of
simplemente
categories
y
that I would
rápidamente
briefly mention.
analizamos la base
We
legal
analyzed the
de
legal
10
basis
países
that the
en
10 countries
relación con la
had in
prevención,
relationship with
erradicación y
preventing and
sanción
eradication and
contra las
sanctioning
mujeres
violence
en
against
relación
women
con la trata de
in
personas,
relation to
con la
human
prevención,
trafficking,
con
and in relation with disappeared people, institutional mechanisms and institutional architecture of these countries around this phenomena, and how they were interpreting this, what they were legislating and protecting with what approach, how the mechanisms were created to generate statistical data. Are they exist? They don't exist? Are they standardized? How do they relate? And if that data are available and comparable and of good quality, and finally, they are expressing what they should express us in order to make decisions that should be taken in terms of prevention and eradication of violence against girls, adolescents, and women and LBTG. This study was coordinated in 2021 with the initial portion of the pandemic, and in the cloud of words that you see, tries to put in a dynamic way the most analytical categories that we were approaching or considering in 2018, which is a common feeling of feminist activists and human rights defenders that was exacerbated by the pandemic and in terms of structural changes in the society. The worsening of violence against women, the action frames reflected on the core responsibility between productive work and reproductive work, crisis of life means the working in the context of vulnerability and risk, and the singularity of this approach that has a gender approach but needs to include age, original peoples, and national origin in terms of migratory flows and socioeconomic conditions, because the worsening of poverty by the pandemic, as Dr. Zuleta mentioned, a reality that needs to be considered. So in this word cloud, we see small print with regards to what information and the studies giving us in terms of what happens with girls and women who have disappeared. Women and children and girls trafficking is seen as an isolated phenomena, and we're going to discuss this later. And gender-based violence against women and children as an extreme expression of that violence, and the need to start integrating these concepts and categories so they can also have a better dialogue with the data of the isolated phenomena, which is how this has been considered at this moment from the countries and the states and from the laws in terms of statistical production. So you're going to see that as a study hypothesis, as published and are available in the UNDP webpage, we started with hypothesis by the recommendation number 2, and at least 18 studies with recommendations or general observations of international rights of human rights. So if in the disappearance of women and girls, and along with femicide and feminicide constitute extreme expression of gender violence. So it is important to ask, to what extent do the selected countries, we work with many countries and we analyze 72 laws in order to show you the findings that I will comment later. It's important to know to what extent selected countries effectively link violence against women and children reporting and recording systems to extreme expressions of violence starting from the hypothesis that human trafficking, in particular sexual exploitation, not only this kind of negative practice against girls and adolescents with extreme gender-based violence, if that is being considered or not, to what extent that information is efficacious in preventing this extreme violence towards women and girls, to what extent does express the causes and consequences of this extreme violence and promote useful and relevant interpretative frameworks for the understanding of particularly vulnerable contexts that we see in our region that are exacerbated in the post-pandemic context and for public policies. So we were able to indicate that the third generation laws for preventing and sanctioning violence against women integrate provisions for the use of statistical data. That although we have records and standards generating registries and generating information from the human traffic phenomena in its criminal relevance as their social relevance, does not necessarily integrate the variable of gender-based violence, and the same for these people who have disappeared. That the institutional mechanism focus on measurement, femicide and feminicide, and focus on the data collection. That is important because the region, in addition to the ECLAC observatory, has the data and can express what's going on in terms of incidence of femicide and feminicide in the region. But on the other hand, they have left aside and forget the possibility of having a better promotion of interdisciplinary teams that could also be looking at these relationships between femicide, feminicide, human trafficking, and disappearance of girls and women. And we also need to indicate that the registers of disappeared people also show information that at this moment is at the level of number, and the reports generated by the family members of people who have disappeared, but perhaps not necessarily we are working in such a way that they generate useful information for the analysis of the phenomena from the perspective of the hypothesis that we are proposing, which is the hypothesis relationship between extreme violence, gender-based violence against girls, adolescents, and the relationship with feminicide, human trafficking, and disappearance of people. But it is possible to have these relationships and how they are included in some of the regions of the country that we study. First of all, when we typify human trafficking and there are disappearance of people from aggravating circumstances, and when we have disappearance of people, very few countries have defined we are following the conventionality in terms of forced disappearance of people, but very few countries, except Central America, that they have those mechanisms of protecting the phenomena that had to do with systemic violence and disappearance against women and children. There is a relationship on the aggravated circumstances. The legislation of missing people is dissimilar in the region. As I just mentioned, there's an absence of these missing persons and children as an expression of gender violence. The technical standard for the design and implementation of information systems promote greater production of information and that could also coordinate the phenomena. What we saw is that there is a tension between the institutional sectors and these so-called quote-unquote experts and experts that we met from these 10 countries in what is the security doctrine in the crime of human trafficking and their penal criminal relevance and those people missing in relation to structural violence and organized crime that tends to go away from the understanding of human trafficking and the disappearance of girls and women as extreme forms of gender-based violence. There's a national or international homologation to talk about the models of disappearances of women. And although there's a criminal standard of aggravating circumstances, a good part of the statistical production of all the countries is leveraged in the report, in the tools that generate information through administrative registries of operators in institutions and uh, comprehensive services to victims and survivors of violence and trafficking of girls and women. Except for the absolute value of femicide or feminicide, there were no satirizing. In the data is generated by specialized officers or prosecutors. Depending on the country, the vision is always and it still is, as Dr. Zuleta mentioned, coordinated by the protocol of Palermo. And the issue that we are discussing here is that understanding that it's transnational organized crime, the expressions of human trafficking are diverse at the national, local, and the operations of this type of crime, and therefore we think it's important to open those approaches and interpretation, and that every country should have commissions or international committees that work and generate protocols to protect, to care for victims and survivors, and to analyze the statistics through administrative registers. But those who have been in this type of committee can say that this is a difficult work that takes too long and imply a consensus on how to approach the data so it express what we want to express. And I think it's very important to indicate that information is coming from reports in missing persons, both in human trafficking and disappeared persons. We have specific protocols about the confidentiality of that data. It's not that it doesn't exist, but due to the character of organized crime, we have reinforced protocols. This generates from expert, and the data generated contains the specific variables for this purpose, basically through the police forces in the regions to generate search and location alerts. And we saw that 90% of the cases, public statistics are dissimilar in terms of period, absolute value, and dating. We were not able to do a comparison of the 10 countries. Each country had its own indicators, even if they were always talking about human trafficking between safety and organized crime, and having this as a phenomenon that didn't have any criminal relevance unless they had elements to open an investigation. As we all know, in 100% of the countries, the data does not link the phenomena technically by leveraging regulatory opportunities in order to work with the data and to have more complex frameworks. In the aggravating circumstances of feminicide and feminicide, the countries are working, are trying to work the relationship that exists between the femicide and feminicide as a result of one of the actions in human trafficking. and also the link specifically between the people and human trafficking starts to become important in the interpretation framework of the countries, and that has to do with aggravation of sexual violence, lies higher cost on the lives of girls, adolescents, and women. And we don't have that conciliation in any of the countries we studied. As I mentioned, were 10. At the beginning of the discussion of femicide and feminicide, and how to conciliate this data and how to work, and what were the variables and indicators that we could start considering that the behavior of the crime and this violence against girls, adolescents, women, and LGBTG. There was a discussion between the statistical experts. It was the analysis unit where they concentrated, and it's still being expressed in some countries where they focus the discussion with showing the files and the documents. It's a vision of the statistic that of course needs to be documented, but the analysis unit cannot be made by the file. It's not the file, it's the phenomenon of these women, adolescents, and girls that are victims or survivors of this phenomenon. So we, as a region and as countries, have very important learning of how to generate the data and establish indicators. And this is much more systematic and profound for feminicide, and feminicide is less in human trafficking from the perspective of the violence against women and girls, or being an extreme way of violence against women and children, especially those who consider to human trafficking and are linked to discrimination and this nocive, this deleterious practice against children and adolescents, and the disappearance as an action or a constitutive element of any of these three phenomena. And we also found a weakness of critical reading of context variables and factors directly linked to extreme violence or systematic against women and girls, because we, in the study B, so that we all acknowledge the existence that produce unprotection. Some territories where the states are not paying attention to the data, or the data doesn't arrive, or the phenomenon is not expressed because the reports are not even possible. The rural areas, the inner cities, when there's organized crime present, territories of original peoples, because we are unable to coordinate with their insights from these people and how the structural context and the structural factors of vulnerability affect territories. If we can achieve this interpretation, this approach between the three phenomena, we can put on the table those laws that would allow us to have this statistical dialogue and this production data from these three phenomena as extreme violence against vulnerable women. We may have a better understanding of the factors, causes, and consequences of the lack of protection. We could do public policies that are based on evidence. We're working in that direction, but it's very difficult if we leverage all the information from the judicial actors. We need to strengthen the capacity of administrative registries, and we need to leverage that learning curve in terms of femicide and feminicide, that these are learning that can be used to the phenomena that we're talking about. And it's we see how the states that doctors, as Dr. Zulota mentioned, that we need to land it to the territories. The data, the statistical data per se is not sufficient is in multidimensional models and multicultural models, but if the statistical data is too poor, it has too many obstacles, also going to show or information that is not allow the better decision making, and we're going more to the virtuous circle of integral reparation of centrality in the right of life, free of violence, and human rights for women, victims, and survivors. Finally, I would like to say that we share, as it has been stated in the study, that we have a social emergency of gender-based violence against women, children, and adolescents, and LGTB plus people. And the Andean Health Organization brings that to discussion. It's so important because it has to do with the care of all the human beings. And that if we walk understanding what's happening with the generation of information, statistical data, but also qualitative studies, and we have not to confuse the reality with data. And finally, we're going to have more useful information and adequate for prevention is phenomena. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ariadna, for your presentation, the clarity in expressing the results of the study number 5 of the Spotlight Initiative of the UNDP program for Latin America, called The Importance of the Data for the Prevention and Eradication of Violence Against Women and Children in February 2021 as part of the UN program for the UNDP. Diana Reyes mentioned that although there is registry to have an idea of human traffic and disappearance, there are no indicators allowed to disaggregate the data due to gender violence or sexual orientation of the people that are missing. On the other hand, there's no standardized indicator for an international analysis that's adequate. She also expressed that the recognition of cases of disappearances depends on the files and the presence of the reportings, which increases the under-registration of the deficit of design and collection strategies is an obstacle to identify a clear possibility of having effective actions, and these data are important for decision makers. Decision making that is based on evidence. It's also important to link and involve the community in decision making, and strategies such as those presented at the beginning by Gilberto Zuleta will allow us to provide the other pathway that complements strengthening of our data registry on this important topic. We thank Ariadna Reyes for the presentation. Now, I will hand over the moderation to my colleague, Danitza Kenta. She's a public health professional and a member of the Horas CONU. And welcome, dear Danitza, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, estimada Ruby.
Thank you, dear Ruby. Good afternoon, everyone.
Bueno, para la siguiente exposición,
For the next presentation, we invite Johnny Maita. Johnny Maita is a lawyer and bachelor in education from the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos with a master's degree in procedural law and public management, specialist in family law, has more than 10 years of experience in dealing with cases of gender violence and members in the family group. He has made different presentations in diploma courses and courses related to his specialty, serves as director of the Territorial Coordination Unit and currently serves as a lawyer responsible for the strategic litigation team of the Services Coordination Unit of Aurora National Program.
Adelante,
Go ahead,
licenciado Johnny Maita. El espacio es
Dr. Johnny Maita, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Danitza. Igual
Thank you, Danitza. Thank you for the invitation on representative of the Aurora National Program, Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Populations. We're going to start to talk about the topic of today, about the situation, the current situation, public policy challenges regarding the cases of disappearances and trafficking of girls, boys, adolescents, and women in Peru. My presentation is divided in 4 parts. We're going to start with the first part, talking about the current status. As was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, in Peru, as well as in the Andean region, the cases of women reported as missing is double that of men. So we're going to look at some data that has been recorded. So we have that between January to December of 2022, in the disappearance of, and the investigations made by the Public Ombudsman Office, there were 1,821 alert notes of missing women, and we're going to find that 1,821 adults and 3,560 girls and adolescents who represent 66%. So this is a very significant, alarming figure, but there are also other registers such as that from the National Police Force, which is a region as based on reports, and we're going to find that the National Police recorded 11,524 cases of women missing, and they located only 5,558. So only 48% were located. This was in 2022. And still alarming figures. Less than half have been found. So we need to take some actions. See what's been doing. So we're going to see that the disappearance of women is considered as a gender-based violence because it occurs just by the fact that she is a woman, and this may be linked to feminicide cases. And we're analyzing data of women who have victims of feminicide. So during the 2022, we had 130 cases of feminicide, and when we compare this to these cases, how many were reported as missing, we found that 22 cases, the victims of feminicide have been previously reported as missing. Now we're talking only about victims of feminicide, because in the case of feminicide attempts, that's a different data that can be higher. So we're talking only of those who have, unfortunately, ended up in feminicide. Those cases, we're talking that 16% had been previously reported as missing. Now, going to data of human traffic in the context of Peru, we're going to find that in Peru, according to figure from the Public Prosecutor's Office during 2021 and part of 2022, the Prosecutor's Office specialized in human trafficking have attended a total of 3,525 victims nationwide, of which 43% are foreigners. and with a higher incidence of victims of Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, and Colombian. And according to information provided by the Directorate Against Trafficking in Persons and Smuggling of Migrants, from January to October 2022, a total of 125 victims of Venezuelan nationality have been assisted and rescued, of which 28 were minors and 387 were adults. As an additional information, we may mention that the most important ways of exploitation are work and sexual. The areas where this illegal mining is produced, where we have the largest amount of victims of this type of crimes. This is the data that we have regards the current situation about the disappearance and trafficking. Now, the disappearance of people is aggravated because due to age and development. So girls and adolescents are more prone to suffer these situations. So we need to have public policies to solve these problem, the social problem, and we're going to find that we need to consider the right to be searched. An international convention establishes that autonomous right to search, that is the right of the missing person to be searched for, and the right to search on the part of other victims. So we're going to find that this right consists mainly of the rescue, doing identification with all possible resources, and in case of found dead, the dignified restitution. I mentioned this because in Peru, there have been some standard changes in the legislation that trend to strengthen the search of people who are missing. Now, the consequences of the disappearance of a girl or woman may be and end up of feminicide or human trafficking or sexual violence, as it has been mentioned, and the frequency of cases almost doubles that of men, and it will be indicating an extended phenomena in different sectors of our society. And this implies that we need to promote public policies with an effective search from which promote cooperation and collaboration of all government agencies, and this requires a coordinated policy on the part of the government based on adequate legislation that confirms the right of victims to a state policy oriented to promote, with all possible means, the effective search for missing persons. And under this conception, we've been working, but also as the part of it, we should also give the opportunity to the participation of the victims' families. Although the police is responsible for searching people who are missing, it is evident that usually the families who have had to promote the investigations. So that is why sometimes there is a higher demand of information for intervention, information and accountability. In Peru, for example, there is a social collective that's called Families United for Justice that are organized and are family of victims of feminicide, and they are carrying out several activities to demand from the authorities and also help in the prevention or to demand justice. And also in the case of missing persons, they are creating awareness when a woman has disappeared and to try to help in their rescue. So it is important from the ministry that we have contact with them and we give them space so they can consider their needs and expectations and provide guidance and work together. So in training work, we are participating together with them. Now we look at the progress made in drug trafficking and disappearance of children, adolescents, and women. This is considered to be gender-based violence. We're going to see that the complexity for case management, the search of missing people, a complex process due to the fact that the situation is especially characterized by the deliberate concealment of information about the fate and whereabouts of the missing person. So this lack of information generates is difficult and painful for many families who we cannot locate the person. This too, in terms of case management. With regards to the standards and regulations, there's been an evolution that has been constant, and we have been modifying, for example, from 2007 to 2021, there have been several modifications. Maybe I can highlight now the creation of Specialized Prosecutor's Office, the National Plan Against Human Trafficking, implies public policies to fight against this crime. In the case of national normative development on missing persons, we have something similar. From 2003, we have the creation of the National Registry of Information on Missing Persons, and to highlight also that in 2018, where we look at the measures to address cases of missing people in vulnerable situations, we're going to see we make more adequations, and in 2022, last year, there was a change of the vision. Either this problem includes the disappearance of women, children, and adolescents by private individuals to the list of modalities of gender violence considered in the Regulation Law 3064. This is the standard that regulates the eradication of violence against women by family members. We haven't initially considered as part of the modalities of gender violence the disappearance of women, girls, and adolescents. And there is in the regulation, we add this in the past year to include these modalities in gender violence. That gives us the understanding there's a change in how we consider the disappearance of women, children in Peru. So we have developed different mechanisms to deal with these cases. In the Ministry of Interior, we have a web page to help in the search of Peruvians that have disappeared, that has created by the law 29685, and we can see the dissemination of the reports of people that have disappeared, which is separated into groups, underage and overage. They allow to have a list of all the people that have been reported as missing, and they stay there. This information is centralized, and we can know real time. They have registered the characteristics of that person, and it's very helpful to have a registry as such for any consultation, or we start looking for that person. In addition, the Peruvian state has implemented a specialized public policy in the search of missing people between 1980 and 2000.
de repente un poco diferente, pero igual
This is maybe a different topic, but I still want to mention it
pues el año
because
pasado.
these are forced
Pero
disappearances,
también el Perú lo
but
está tomando en
Peru is
consideración
also taking
y
into
está
consideration
incluyéndolo dentro de
and
las
is
políticas
including in
en la atención de los casos.
policies
¿Ok?
of case management.
Ahora,
Now,
como le mencionaba, el
as
Estado
I mentioned, the Peruvian
debería
state has been
registrar
implementing a
especialmente
public policy
mujeres
specialized in the search of missing women and a registry of missing women
y está adoptando la
that
política
adopts a
nacional
gender
de llevar
perspective for those citizens who decide to report the disappearance of women or girls
ante las
to the
autoridades
corresponding authority.
y, como ya la mencioné también,
And
mediante el decreto, un decreto
through Supreme Decree,
dentro de la ley
they
1564,
included in Law
que ahí no me voy a detener mucho, quería
3364
mostrarles
just to show you
lo que es
what
rápidamente cómo es que se vienen atendiendo los casos.
how we are managing cases. There's a report.
El mito que era anteriormente, pues el tema de que
There
había
was a
que
myth
muchas horas o 48
that you
horas
need
para
to
tener
wait
una denuncia, no,
24 or
ha habido
48
bastante,
hours for report.
bastante comunicación
Now
de
there's a
que
lot of
no es
effort communicating that
requisito
this
para
is
tener
not a requirement to
una
file a
denuncia.
report.
Entonces, vamos a ver qué se puede hacer en la comisaría
So this
o
can be
en
done at the
la Policía
police
Nacional.
station.
Se recepciona la denuncia,
They
inmediatamente
receive the report
se pasa
and
a una
it
etapa
is
de
immediately
búsqueda,
go to a
se emiten
portion
algunas
of
alertas que
research
ya
and
están
search.
interconectadas
We issue alert notes that are connected among the police
y también hay
force.
una alerta de
And
emergencia
there's also an
y
emergency
hay
alert for
algunas
the cases
adolescentes y
of
mujeres
girls,
víctimas de
boys,
violencia
and
que
adolescents
conocen
and
pues
women who are victims of
una alarma
violence.
de repente con una mayor alerta que la otra
One will have a higher degree of alert,
no
but
puede
they
ser
almost have the
y se
same
inicia la
effect.
búsqueda, ¿no?
And we start
posteriormente
the
pues
search.
inician las diligencias inmediatas con algunas
And
declaraciones
the initial procedure with
de
statements and to see if
violencia.
there's any
Recordemos,
previous report
una
of
mujer
violence,
víctima de violencia
because a woman who's a
puede ser
victim of violence
que haya sido intervenida
may
por la
have
agresora y
already
haya podido ser
been affected by their
secuestrada,
aggressor and
violada
kidnapped
y puede haber sido víctima de feminicidio.
and may have been a victim of feminicide.
Pues
So we're going to find
el haber presentado denuncias
by
previas
having
de
previous
violencia
reports of
puede ser
violence
indicador de
could
un
be an
posible acto de
indicator
violencia. Entonces,
of an
todas
emergency
estas
alert.
evidencias
All that
o
work
denuncias anteriores se recaban,
and
se
previous
verifican para
reports
poder
are
buscar
considered
o al menos tener indicios de dónde
to
puede estar.
have the
¿Ok?
clue of where to search.
Cuando no es ubicada,
When the person is not
la
located,
víctima se continúa, o sea, hay un
we can
periodo para
there's a
la
period
investigación y búsqueda por parte de la Policía
for
Nacional. Hay un
research and
periodo y
search,
cuando no es ubicada, se
and when
pasa
they don't
a
find
una
the
fiscalía para
person,
continuar con la búsqueda. Cuando es ubicada, la menor, si es una menor
when
de edad,
the
hay un
person
procedimiento
is
para entregar a los
located,
padres.
if it's a minor, there's a procedure
Si es
to
víctima de violencia, también
take them to
intervienen
their
otras instituciones
parents.
del Estado como
And we
la
have other
Secretaría
institutions
Nacional
of the
de Salud, hay un
state with the
procedimiento
Ministry of
también para el
Health,
tema de
Ministry of
hacer
Women.
de
There's also an issue
protección para esta
of asking protection
persona víctima de violencia.
for that person that is a
Cuando es
victim of
adolescente
violence.
o con
And
discapacidad
when it's
también
the elderly or with disability,
puede que ser
we're going to see
el reconocimiento médico legal
that we do
y
the
el asesoramiento legal a los familiares.
evaluation and also
Ahora,
taken to their
los
family members.
desafíos
Now, regarding to the
que tenemos,
challenges
pues
that we have,
encontramos en primer lugar
we find first
frente a esta
that
problemática se debe pues
we
desarrollar
need to
iniciativas
develop
de
preventive
género,
measures with
niñez y
gender
adolescencia interseccional.
approach.
Es muy importante el
It
tema de
is
las
very
medidas
important
preventivas.
to take preventive
Esto
measures.
justamente permite
They
actuar
allow to
antes de que ocurra un hecho.
act before
Y eso siempre a veces
this happens,
siempre nosotros tenemos
and
presente
we always have
al
this
momento de
present
atender los casos de violencia,
when we consider a case of
porque
violence,
dependiendo del nivel de riesgo del
because
secuestro,
depending on the level of risk,
puede ser víctima de desaparición
they may be
una
victims of
persona.
disappearances.
También tenemos pues como otro
We
punto
also
fortalecer la
have a
intervención,
necessary to
la
strengthen the
cooperación
intervention
por
and
parte de la
coordination
policía,
by
de
the
los núcleos de
police
defensa,
force,
unidades de protección especial,
the Special
en casos
Protection
de
Units, the
desaparición,
CEMs,
así
in the
como
case
coordinar
of
las
the
instituciones
missing
procesales
persons, and to
para
coordinate
brindar
relevant
apoyo a las familias
institutions to provide
que se
support to the
encuentran en
families
procesos de búsqueda.
involved in the search
Seguiremos
process.
trabajando, pero hay que
We have
fortalecerlo.
been working on this, but we need to make it
Tenemos
stronger.
pues
We also
otro reto que es el
have
fortalecimiento de
another
las
challenge is
capacidades
to
de
strengthen
la
the
policía para
capacity
atender
of the
casos de
police
trata de personas
personnel
y
to
casos de
deal with cases of
desaparición,
human trafficking and
apelando
missing
a la ley
persons
de género y
using a
conocimiento de
gender
género.
and human rights
Y también
approach,
se
and
va a
also
impulsar la implementación
to
de un
promote the
mecanismo
implementation
centralizado
of a
para la
mechanism,
distribución de notas de
the
alerta para las
dissemination of
zonas de
alert
emergencia
notes and
rurales.
emergency alerts in rural areas
Estas zonas pues
where there
se
is
carece
no
de
internet
cobertura de internet.
access in these areas.
La situación geográfica pues
and the geographical situation prevents that this emergency alert and alert nodes can reach at a greater speed. Finally, the last challenge, we consider that the national and local media should take an active role in disseminating alert notice and emergency alerts issued for missing children, adolescents, and women affected by gender-based violence. This will allow the community to know that those who are missing are at risk and to inform the police about any information that may contribute to their. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias a usted,
Thank you,
estimado Johnny Maita, por
dear
su
Johnny Maita,
presentación.
for your presentation.
Y como usted le presentó,
As you mentioned,
comentó acerca de la notoria
you talk
vulnerabilidad
about the
de las niñas
vulnerability of girls and adolescents
desapariciones,
in
debido
terms
a
of
que se registraron
disappearances because they registered
360 durante el año
3,560
2022,
during
siendo más del
2022,
doble
more
del
than
número
double
registrado
the number
de
of
niñas y mujeres adultas.
women compared to men.
Asimismo, en enero de diciembre de
In January
2022
to
se
December of
registraron
2022,
137
there were
casos de feminismo,
137
de los
feminicides,
cuales 22
of
casos
which 22 cases
habían sido
the
reportados
victims had
como
been
desaparecidos.
previously reported as missing.
En el Perú existen avances
In
normativos
Peru,
que
there's some
permiten a través
national
del Ministerio del Interior Nacional una
progress,
página para
and the
conocer
Ministry of the Interior has a
acerca
web
de
page to
las
contribute to
personas
the search
desaparecidas.
of missing persons.
Existen diversos retos
And there are
que
several
rodean
challenges
la
in the
búsqueda
fight
de
against
las niñas,
reduction the
niños, adolescentes y
disappearance of
jóvenes. Sin
girls,
embargo,
boys,
se han logrado
adolescents, and
grandes
women,
avances con el
but we can make
acompañamiento
major progress
intersectorial
with the
y
intersectorial
coordinación de
effort
todos los
and the
niveles.
coordination at every level.
Estimado Johnny,
Dear Johnny,
reiteramos el agradecimiento por la
we
excelente
thank you
disertación.
for your
Nos
excellent
han llegado
dissertation.
muchas
We have
felicitaciones.
received many
Le
congratulations and
invitamos a
questions.
permanecer en
We
la
invite you to
para
remain in the
continuar con
room
el diálogo a partir
to
de nuestro
continue
tema.
with the Q&A.
Agradecemos a todas las
We
personas
thank all the
conectadas del
people
Ministerio de Salud,
connected from the Ministry of
academia,
Health,
entidades y
academia,
organizaciones
various
sociales
entities and
de
social
diferentes países
organizations
como
throughout the world,
Argentina,
countries of
Chile,
Argentina, Belize,
Bolivia,
Bolivia, Chile,
Colombia,
Colombia,
Perú, Uruguay,
Peru,
Venezuela
Uruguay,
y Bolivia.
Venezuela, among others.
Hemos recibido muchos
We
saludos
have
y
received many
muchísimas
greetings.
gracias.
Thank you so much.
Bueno, entonces para empezar
Well, to
el
start
diálogo a
this
partir de las
dialogue
preguntas
from the questions
formuladas,
posed,
solicito a
I
a
ask
los
the
ponentes, a
speakers
mis
to
ponentes,
please turn
que
on
enciendan
their
sus cámaras durante el
cameras
desarrollo de este
during the
webinar.
development of this webinar.
Las y los
The
participantes
participants have
tienen
left
algunas inquietudes y
some
algunas preguntas
concerns,
para
and we will do the
realizar
best
en
to
materia
answer
de salud.
most of them.
Empezaremos
We will
con
start with
Gilberto Zuleta.
Gilberto
Tenemos tres
Zuleta. We
preguntas
have three questions
para usted, de las
for
cuales
you.
puede elegir las dos más
You may
importantes
choose
para
the two
responder en esta
more
oportunidad.
important
Entonces, la
to
primera
respond.
pregunta
The
es,
first question is,
¿cuáles considera que
what do
son
you
los
consider
principales
to
retos
be the
para la
most
reducción
important
de personas
challenges to reduce
desaparecidas
the
con un
disappearance
enfoque de
of people
género y curso de
with a
vida en
gender
Latinoamérica?
approach and life course in
La
Latin
otra
America?
pregunta es,
The second
¿existe
question
alguna
is,
experiencia
is there
desarrollada en
any
otro
experience
continente
developed in
que
other
pueda
continents
adaptarse
that may be
adecuadamente a la realidad
replicated
de
by
Sudamérica?
tailoring to the reality of South America?
Y la última pregunta es,
The final
¿qué
question is,
estrategias se
what
deberían utilizar
strategies should be
para
used
hacer prevención dentro de las
to
escuelas?
make prevention in schools?
Adelante.
Go ahead, please.
Puede elegir dos de las preguntas.
Gracias.
You can choose
Anotado.
two questions. I was just writing down the question. Well,
Complejo elegir dos porque creo que
it's difficult to
tres
choose two
abarcan temas
because the
muy
three
distintos,
consider
pero creo
different
que
topics
muy interesantes
and are very
poderlos discutir,
interesting
aunque en aras
to
del tiempo
discuss them.
voy a
But
tratar de
because of time, I'm going to try to
en las tres preguntas, pero
respond the three
brevemente.
questions,
En la
but in
primera,
general
el
terms.
tema
In the
de
first one, I think
personas desaparecidas,
missing
creo
people
que
with a
los retos
gender
son varios.
approach, the
Qué bueno que
challenges
nos
are
toca
several.
qué
In
bueno
fact,
tener acá
it's
a mi
good to have
colega Johnny Mata, porque
Johnny Mata
desde nuestra
because
oficina, junto con el
our
Ministerio del
office,
Interior
together with the Ministry of the
y
Interior
OIM,
and the
desarrollamos aquí en
OIM,
Perú un estudio
we
sobre
developed in Peru a
retos y
study on missing
identificamos
people where we
algunos datos y algunos
identify
challenges
some data and
que esperamos
challenges
presentar en
that
breve
we
y
hope
que
to
es bueno
present
contar
in
con la presencia de
soon.
Johnny
And
y el espacio que nos
it's
permite
good to
este
have
espacio para
Johnny in
compartir.
our
Pero
office.
brevemente creo que
briefly, I think that the challenges in terms of missing people or persons are several. Most of them have been mentioned by Johnny. You got the myth of the 24 hours, and in some cases is 48 hours, in some others up to 72 hours. We also have some stigmatization and some gender bias that are quite strong. We should never forget that all this conceptualization and the development of feminicides and femicides is also present in the area where there's a number of prejudices facing the reports of what was initially missing women. Now she left with a boyfriend, she left with somebody partying. They go against the effective response to those reports. And also, I think that there is an issue of information in terms of the channels that the citizens can go to report this. I think that sometimes the institutions, in their effort to try to establish in clear projects or process, they forget that the citizen that has to go to these instances is not aware of the names or the processes itself. And this makes that the citizens not aware, and there's a barrier for discussion of how to reach them. So this generates many barriers. So we can talk about challenges in stigmatization, in communication, and the challenges for reporting, and also challenges around the myth of how to activate this type of scenarios. The second question about experiences in other continents, yes, there's several. There are several experiences we can find in where you can access with the core barcode of this event or a web page. And the experiences are based mostly on the response to the need of the territory implemented. That has been key. So when we review the 39 experiences that can be found on that document, you can identify that they exist. In most of them, there are partnerships with local partners, which is key. Why do I highlight this? And I mentioned it in my intervention because when we talk about human trafficking, we need to acknowledge that this is the located phenomena. We need to insist that human trafficking, although phenomena that occurs throughout the world and they share elements globally, abuse of the position of vulnerability, exploitation, vulnerable situations, which affects mostly women and girls. We cannot think that trafficking is the same in all the world. It's not the same what we can find in a region, for example, Guayaquil, to what we may see in Bogota or in Leticia, which is a triple border with Peru and Colombia and Brazil. So it has its own characteristics and feel this phenomenon of human trafficking. So the experience needs to respond to those needs. I think that the most important experiences to close these questions are to first consider the will of the private sector. Once the private sector is willing to act, we need to respond to that context of national character. Studies like Ariadna shared with us allow to identify what are the challenges and how to join efforts with the private sector. But we basically have financial sector for strengthening and identifying money laundering. We have the technological sector for creating mechanisms of reports that are anonymous and that have an immediate response to referentiation. And that's something that I think consider very important and from our region has been linking the tourism sector when we talk about the hotel sector and transportation sector in the airports, how that has been proactively linked to generate code, quality certification code with tools that allow to operationalize the report from the lobby of the hotel, and another similar experience like airports and airlines. In the Dominican Republic, through Aerodome, we had a partnership with all the authorities and companies that work in the airport of Santo Domingo. So the joint efforts in an environment where it's needed. There's some airlines committed to this issue and have adopted prevention campaign and have financed them. That's a key exercise. More than thinking an experience that may be adapted is to think in the needs of our territory and experiences that we can rescue in areas. So I invite you to share or learn about that document. And finally, the third about prevention strategies in schools. This is an effort with three parts involving the teachers. The teachers have to be involved in learning about what is human trafficking, what are the risks for disappearances, how to report it, and these teachers group should be prepared to take this information to their students with communication. There's no use in having all these standards to students in the final years, but we need to know how to reach them with some interactive tools. The third player that we never should forget when we talk about school, and that's a family. The family is not part of the protective environment school, community school. We need to construct solid relationship between these groups. If the mother or the father has a situation, they can find support from the teachers in order to find, and vice versa. The teachers identifies a situation of risk and also have a communication with the family. Some time ago, we did an exercise where we built scenarios of joint preventions between the community, parents, and teachers, where with the intervention of three players, we were able to create exercises of prevention. So that would be my suggestion for that last question. And that's it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, estimado
Thank
Gilberto.
you, dear
Hemos hablado
Gilberto.
entonces del tema de la
We talk
estigmatización y
about
cómo realmente sería el marco de
stigmatization and
mejorarlo,
how
¿no?
it
Con
should
recuerdos
be
oportunos de
eliminated
personas
for a timely
sobrevivientes.
report of people who are
Asimismo,
missing and
enfocar las necesidades para
focus
las
on the needs to
diferentes experiencias dentro de
adequate the different
Latinoamérica
experiences in Latin American
y
area
obviamente el
and
papel que deben
the
cumplir
role that
el cuerpo
the
docente, la
teachers
familia
group
y
and the
también involucrar a
family
los
and
estudiantes
also
para
involve
poder
the students
mejorar
to
esta
reduce
situación.
and
Así
improve
que
these statistics.
muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Entonces procederemos
So
con
now we will
Ariadna Reyes.
go on with Ariadna
Tenemos
Reyes.
otras tres
We have
preguntas que son
three
distintas
questions
para usted.
for you.
La primera es,
First,
¿hay alguna experiencia en la región
any
donde se
experience in the
promueve el
region
desarrollo
where
de un
you
sistema de
highlight the
información
development of an
que haya
information
servido para el
system
planteamiento
that's been
y
useful
desaparición
for
de
prevention
personas migrantes?
policies, proposals for missing people?
La segunda pregunta
The second
es,
question,
¿qué deben contemplar los sistemas de
what
información
should
para que
information
la
systems
información
consider
sirva
so that
para la
information
elaboración
is
de
serves
medidas
as an
contra
input to
la violencia contra las
elaborate
mujeres y
prevention measures
adolescentes?
of violence against women and disappearance of
Y la
women?
tercera pregunta
And the third
es,
question is,
¿qué considera que son los
what do you
pasos
consider
prioritarios
are the
para
priority steps
fortalecer
to
la cooperación
strengthen
internacional
the
para
international
responder
cooperation
conjuntamente
to
a
have
la
a joint
problemática de la que
response to
estamos
this
hablando?
problem that we are talking today?
Puede elegir dos o tres
Use
preguntas y
two
hacerlo de
or
manera
three
simultánea.
questions.
Muchísimas gracias, Danitza.
Thank you,
Muchísimas gracias a
Danitza.
la audiencia y a
Thank you to
quienes
the
elaboraron las
audience
preguntas.
and those who send their
Mm,
questions.
Respecto a experiencia en las
With
comunidades
regards to experiences, the
cercanas
region that
al
can be
ecosistema de
highlighted
información,
of useful information
no
systems,
desde aquí el doctor Johnny, pero desde el
Dr.
estudio Perú,
Johnny
que es
from
uno de
the
los
study
países que ha
Peru is
tenido
one of the
mayor
countries
desarrollo
that has
en
greater development
la región
in
respecto
the
a
region
los
with
sistemas de
regards to
información
the
y sobre
information
cómo
systems, but above
a
all
abordar las
to
relaciones
the
y cómo lo prioriza la
approach
información que incluso implica
of
la
those
reforma de la ley
relations
de
that implies
acceso
a
al
reform of
conocimiento, pero que no
2022
fue integrada en el estudio porque
that was not considered in the study because the study was completed in 2021 of the gender dimension in those three phenomena and the relationships that imply for the definition of a public policy, but also to establish the variables and indicators that have to be expressed by express those realities, and to have evidence-based information for decision making in public policies in terms of prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. But the prevention has to be at all levels.
También lo que podemos ir registrando es
because we can see that we're forgetting about the community-based prevention, such as what happens in the school, and that is extremely important in order to reduce phenomena. So how they are being expressed area, and also for the comprehensive repair and comprehensive rights defense and protection. So this is of instrumental for this region. And Argentina, in the South Cone and Mexico have made significant progress in terms of political effort, institutional effort, and technical effort. Mexico is facing the different expressions of systemic violence against women, adolescents, and girls. We need to have an information system be successful. And the information systems are expensive. A public investment in a real budget from each state, so those information systems operate and need to operate with different institutions. In some of the slides that Johnny showed us of how they work once there was a report of a missing person. He indicated to the possibility of having information from other institutions and systems in order to have a better response. Information system needs to be of quality based on statistical rules such as the United Nations. The data has to be available and have the possibility of being comparable, and of course have a relationship with groups of interest stakeholders with regards to those phenomena. Because if we generate information for me, and for my prosecutor's office, and for my stories and my data, and we cannot dialogue on what's going on, both of the groups of interest and the victims and survivors, you are insisting that an isolated operation, and that's not the case. Statistics are important and a priority, a reality, in order to have more effective information. And the issue of investment of and for international cooperation contributes, we need to consider some programs such as Spotlight are promoting this agenda, that this agenda is a priority for the entire region. It is not enough. I think that the approach of human trafficking as an organized crime and the reaction of some elements and teams of the state that may be within the areas of justice administration, and also be part of how the gender obstacles and cultural obstacles are inside those communities and families are preventing us to understand the relationship of the phenomena with gender-based violence. Dr. Sulet and Dr. Johnny also mentioned how the stereotypes, gender stereotypes may be limiting action, both in the family as well as in the state, not only in the family, the community. Perhaps she's late, she'll come which is a story that we can hear in a family community, but also in the police, in the political authority who has the obligation. Things doesn't imply disappearance, feminicide. And I think that it is instrumental that we can this partnership between states, civil society, technicians, those who work on statistics, those who program in Peru, or those who are in the program between violence in Argentina, are very important to have this at the level of international cooperation with this agenda, particularly with missing women, adolescents, and girls, human trafficking, violence, death, in the context of vulnerability. What Dr. Zuleta mentioned, the situation trafficking, and it's also the located feminicide or located feminicide, and should be considered a priority. When we did the study, the countries have or decide what are the crimes in their criminal policy, with the most important on which they're going to pay attention. And in none of them had the gender-based violence included. In none of them at that moment they had human trafficking. And this showed that there were some countries that were working very fast in trying to understand human trafficking. They all have the concern, but there's no priority in the public agenda. It has to be in the political agenda, and it has to be in the cooperation agenda. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, estimada Ariadna.
Thank you, dear Ariadna.
Entonces procederemos con
Now we will go with the
Johnny
questions
Maita.
for Johnny Maita.
Tenemos dos preguntas.
I have two
La
questions.
primera
The
es,
first is,
¿existen espacios de participación
do
para
we
las
have
mujeres
spaces for
en el
participation in
potenciamiento
women
para la formulación de
for the
políticas
formulation of
públicas en
public
temas de
policies
desaparecidos
in
y trata de personas?
issues of disappearance
La
and
segunda
human
pregunta es,
trafficking?
¿cuáles son las
And the second
acciones
question is,
que se están
what
realizando
are the
desde el
actions
Ministerio
being
para
carried out from the ministry
garantizar
to
la
prevent
normalización de la violencia
the
en las redes
normalization of
sociales?
violence in the communication media?
Adelante.
Go ahead.
Bueno, respecto a la primera
Well,
pregunta,
with regards to the first
la
question,
ley 30.364 que, a la que
this
hice mención,
law that I mentioned
pues
in my presentation
fue una norma que la
establishes
finalidad pues es erradicar la
the
violencia.
goal is to eradicate
Entonces, pero fue una norma
violence,
innovadora.
but it was an innovative regulation.
Norma,
I always explain it as a standard or a regulation that had 180 degrees change. And I mentioned this because with the previous law, it was just operational, what the prosecutor's office did, and it was a civil process. It didn't have any crime or criminal sanction. But with the 3364 law, we look at differently. We consider not only of dealing with the sanction process or to prevent this, but also tries to eradicate. First time in terms of violence, we legislate specifically with prevention. And not only that, but we involve all the institutions and ministries of the state. So what stakeholders, the Ministry of Interior, with the police, also involve the prosecutor's office, the economic and finance ministry, because with no budget, I cannot implement any policy or the services for managing. So it involves the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health. So this is a law that tries to coordinate. We create a high-level multisectorial commission. We have working groups, and in the working groups by the civil society, and there is we offer public spaces to civil society. For example, last year we talked about missing persons, and there was a so yes, we are giving space And
son las
in this
instancias
standard, we
locales de
regulate
concertación,
the
instancias
regional
locales de concertación
and
que
local
son delegadas
instances for
directamente a
coordination
través de los
who
gobiernos
are in
locales o
charge
regionales.
by the
Entonces,
local government,
son espacios pues,
regional government. So these are
que
spaces
permiten la intervención también de la
where we
sociedad
allow the
para
intervention of the
poder tratar este
society
tema de
in order to
violencia
solve
que
this
involucra también
issue
la
of violence,
desaparición
which
dentro
involves disappearance
de la
in
región o del
the
distrito,
region or district,
según cada realidad geográfica, ¿no?
depending each
Por lo tanto,
geographical
la
reality.
realidad geográfica es
The
bastante
geographical reality in
complicada
Peru
en
is
este
quite
momento.
different. It's different for each
Respecto a las acciones
region.
de prevención,
Now, with regards to
dentro de nuestro
prevention
proyecto Aurora,
actions
se viene
from the
trabajando
national
en
program
muchas
Aurora, we are
actividades
working
en relación a
with
lo que
many
es
activities
prevención en lo
with
que es
regards to
violencia.
prevention of violence,
Se vienen también trabajando ya desde un tiempo atrás el tema
working
de
for some
incluir
time now,
el tema de género dentro de lo
including
que es el
gender
temario pues,
issue
de los colegios, de los centros
in
educativos,
schools and education
asimismo la
centers,
autonomía económica de la
the
mujer.
economic autonomy of
Estamos con
women.
campañas
We have
prevención de violencia justamente
violence prevention
porque entendemos
campaigns
pues de que
because we
muchas de
understand
las desapariciones que hay
that many of the
en lo que respecta a
disappearances
mujeres o
with regards
niños
to women or children
tienen como un antecedente la violencia.
have
Entonces,
a previous history of
buscamos
violence.
a
So
través de
when
por
this
así decirlo, este cruce de datos, pues que veíamos
comparison of information, we
estaban muy
realize
ligadas, ¿no? Por ejemplo,
that
en el
they're
caso
all
de
linked.
mujeres
For
adultas
example, in the
desaparecidas
case
está
of
muy ligada al
adult women that
feminicide.
are missing
En
is
el caso de niñas y
linked
niños
to feminicide in
está muy ligado a lo que es
children and
el
boys
problema
and girls.
del
It's linked
divorcio y la
to
tenencia de
a
los niños.
divorce
Entonces,
and the
al
who
final los
has
niños son considerados un
who
trofeo y quien se lleva al niño
children are
es
considered a trophy,
la parte, obviamente,
and the
que no
other
sabe dónde está su hijo y está
or
muchas
the other
veces
part that's parent doesn't know where the
no sabe
child is.
si ha sido la expareja o el padre de los niños. Entonces,
So
hay muchas situaciones de
there are many
desaparición
situations of
o incluso
disappearances,
en el tema de lo que es la trata,
or in case,
que son
or
llevados
even in case of
por las
trafficking,
provincias
children
más
who are
cercanas
taken from
a la
one
explotación
region to
laboral,
another for
explotación sexual,
labor exploitation or sexual
están relacionados
exploitation,
pues a lo que es
and this is
violencia.
related to
Entonces, sí, se vienen haciendo
violence.
todas esas
So
acciones
yes, we are
de
being
prevención y
carrying out
prevención
those prevention activities
justamente para
precisely
evitar o erradicar la
to
violencia.
avoid and eradicate the violence.
Muchas gracias, estimado Johnny
Thank
Maita.
you, dear
Entonces,
Johnny Maita. So
procederemos
we
a las
will
dos últimas
proceed
preguntas.
to
Un
the
minuto
last
para
two
todos los
questions
presentes
for all the
y
speakers.
tendrán un minuto para poder
You
hacerlo.
have 1 minute
Entonces,
for your
iniciamos
answer.
las preguntas. La primera es,
The first question.
sin duda alguna, entre
There
los
is no
millones de
doubt that
ciudadanos que se
among
deben
the several
a las sobrevivientes de trata de personas y otras violencias
considerations
contra
needed to be
hombres y
given to
mujeres,
victims of
tienen
violence and
atenciones
survivors,
de salud
we
integral.
have
¿Cuáles
comprehensive
serían
health care.
prioritarias
What
las
priority
políticas
actions should be
municipales
taken
para
in the health
complementar los
sector to
esfuerzos
complement the
en la
efforts
prevención y
in
respuesta a
prevention
los
and
casos?
response of cases?
La segunda pregunta
And the
es,
second question
¿qué
is,
medidas punitivas o
what
sancionadoras existen
sanctions
para los
do we
funcionarios
have
públicos
for
que
those public
favorecen
officials
a
who
las redes de trata de personas?
favor human trafficking
¿Y
networks?
cuál es la diferencia
And
que
what is the
consideran
difference
ustedes
that you
para la
consider
identificación
for the
y report de
identification
funcionarios
and
corruptos?
report of corrupt
¿Y qué
officials?
recomendaciones tienen al
And
respecto?
what recommendations do you have in that regard?
Empezaríamos
We will
conforme al
start
orden de ponencia.
according to the order of presentation.
Estimado Gilberto.
Dear Gilberto,
Entonces, comenzaremos por
so we will start
Reyes.
with Ariadna Reyes.
Adelante.
Go ahead.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you,
Em,
Anita.
las las tres preguntas rápidamente desde mi
The,
experiencia, más bien, más que
from my experience,
necesitamos,
we
necesitamos
need
mayor diálogo y acuerdos
more
presupuestarios,
dialogue and
porque es
agreements with the health sector
fundamental
because the health sector
para la
is a
prevención
vital
de
sector
violencias,
for
también para los
prevention of
para
violence and also
la producción de información
for the
estadística,
generation
por
of
supuesto que también
statistical
para la
information
erradicación de
and
violencia.
also for caring victims and
El sector salud
survivors.
pues, es un sector
The health sector is
regulado,
a regulated
altamente
sector
regulado, al igual que lo que es
as well
el sector justicia.
as the
Y a
justice
veces estos dos
sector.
sectores es muy
Sometimes
difícil
those
que se
two
pongan de
sectors
acuerdo
is very difficult to
y
agree.
necesitamos esos acuerdos
then we need those agreements.
estos acuerdos entre el sector
We as
financiero
society need an agreement
social
between the
social
health
para
sector
poder
and the
obtener mayores coordinaciones
justice sector to have better
una mejor
coordinations
información que nos permita
and
explorar
better
muchísimo mejor lo que
information
está pasando
exchange
con
that
estos
allow us to
niños
identify what's
también
going
desde
on
la esfera de
in
prevención,
these
¿no?
cases and go towards a
Dentro de
prevention.
medidas punitivas
With
en
regards
en
to
el
sanctions,
Código Penal,
each
establece
criminal code
establece una serie
establishes a
de
number
normas en
of
cada país, ¿no es cierto?
standards in each
Que tienen que
country,
ver desde la obligación de
have to do
denunciar
from the
la
obligation to
participación
report and sanctions for that
en
participation
diversas infracciones, incluyendo la
in
discriminación
several violations,
contra
including
la mujer y miembros del núcleo
human
familiar.
trafficking
Algunos
and
casos
violence against
solo la
women.
mujer para otros, pero digamos sobre el mismo fenómeno. Entonces existen medidas
So there
punitivas.
are
No es que esto
sanctions. It's
no
not
sea
that
integral
they
o
have
un tema
not
fundamental
been
en los códigos
integrated
penales
in
nacionales.
the criminal
Y el problema existe
national
porque
code.
trata de personas en
And the
situación
problem
de
that exists is
calle
that human
que tienen
trafficking
una
is a
dimensión
phenomenon
económica
that has
muy importante
a
en
very
América
important
Latina.
economic
Los
dimension,
tratantes
and
son,
traffickers
están vinculados con
are
el crimen
linked
transnacional,
to
tienen
transnational crime
relaciones con formas de
or have
inversión
relation
nacionales
with
pudientes
national
y
operations.
también
There may
actores
be
que tienen de la institucionalidad pública. Eso
players in
lo
this
vamos a saber
public
al
area.
final, digamos, es esos de secretos a gritos.
That's a secret
Ah,
that
¿qué
everybody
está pasando
knows.
aquí? Es
What
que esto
and we see
allá.
what's going on, but
Y eso
that
es
happens
muy,
here,
muy,
happens
muy, muy
elsewhere,
difícil
and it is
poderlo
very difficult to
en todos los
penetrate
mecanismos y puntos de
all
operación de
these
la trata de personas
mechanisms of the
porque está
operations in human trafficking
relacionada con los sistemas
when
de
this is
poder
related to the
en los
groups of
territorios en
power
los que opera.
in the
Es
territories where it operates.
riesgoso, es
It's
terriblemente
extremely
complicado.
risky and complicated.
Debo decir, en mi periodo en fiscalía
I must
promovimos
say
algunos de
that
estos
when I was
elementos,
in the
digamos, lo que es
prosecutor's
el
office, we
sistema
promoted
policial,
some elements, but we were
porque
not
este es uno de los temas más
successful.
difíciles de
This
enfrentar
is one of the
en
most
los
important issues
países
that
que
we
no tienen
face
mecanismos
in human
formales ni
trafficking
relaciones de poder para su sostenimiento.
when we look at the relationship
Em,
power groups.
recomendaciones al respecto.
In
Quiero
recommendations,
comentarles finalmente
just to
que
comment that
vamos a hacer
we
la
tried
verificación al
to
usuario.
do the
Yo, si
typification
ustedes me dicen
for
por
the
dónde
user.
yo me iría para que
If
el
you ask
usuario
me
esté
where should
disponible
I
a
proceed
desmilitarizarse y a
to try
promover una serie de
to
acciones
consider
para
human
los
trafficking,
elementos de prevención y también de
work in
sanción,
prevention
sería la
measures,
verificación a usuarios.
I would with the
Gracias.
typification. Thank you,
Muchas gracias a usted, Ariadna.
Ariadna.
¿Nos puede escuchar, Gilberto?
Can you hear? Can you listen? Can you hear us, Alberto?
¿Puede encender su micro? ¿Prender su
Can
cámara?
you unmute, please?
Ok. Entonces creo que tenemos un problema. Vamos a
I
continuar
think
con
we have a
Johnny.
technical problem. We will continue with Johnny Liza.
Ok.
Go ahead.
A ver, en la primera
Uh,
pregunta en relación
in
a
the
las
first
entidades
question
integrales de salud
related
integral,
to comprehensive health
em,
care,
bueno, es muy importante, ¿no? O
it
sea,
is
siempre
extremely
el nivel de
important
atención de los casos
when we talk about
tiene
case
que haber
management.
etapas
One of the
muy importantes, es la
very important
recuperación
stages is
de la salud, la psicológica,
health recovery,
eh,
psychological
pero
recovery, health in
es una de las
general,
partes que
but
a veces
it's
se nos
also one of
olvida.
the parts
¿En qué
that is set
sentido?
aside or forgotten
Muchas veces
because many
se
times
conecta, o mejor dicho, se traslada a la
we
persona víctima
take the
al sistema de
victim
salud
to the health
y puede programar una
facility
serie de sesiones o terapias
y
más
que
específicas,
program
pero
sessions or
muchas veces
psychological
a veces
therapy,
se
but
pierde
many times along the way,
la comunicación, ya sea por
communication is
motivos
lost by different reasons.
entonces, habría que fortalecer
We will have
el
to
seguimiento del
strengthen
proceso
the
de
follow-up
la recuperación de la
of
salud integral,
the recovery of the
para que
comprehensive
pueda
health. So
estar recuperada la persona víctima.
the victim can recover,
Hay diferentes
fully
medidas
recover. So there are
pero eso es
several
lo que
factors that
buscamos.
affect this.
Respecto a las medidas punitivas,
Now, with regards to sanctions,
que como ya lo mencionó la doctora Diana, sí, pues
as
nosotros
I
también tenemos lo
mentioned,
que es
as Ariana
el Código
mentioned,
Penal
we have
para
the criminal sanction for those
funcionarios, que vendría a ser como una sanción
officials,
por el cargo, y es que claro,
and it is that
relacionado mucho al
it
tema del
is
poder económico
related to
y a veces no
economic
el poder
power.
económico también
And
está
many times the
vinculado al poder
economic power
político,
is related
y
with
no solamente
political
con el
power,
tema de
and not only
con el
of
tema de las drogas,
trafficking, but also with drugs.
por ahí
We've
algunos
seen
supuestos casos en los cuales hay
some
vinculación
cases where there is an
con
alleged
algún
relationship between
poder
drugs
político, pero también la
and
trata
political power, but
puede
also
ser como el
human trafficking and illegal mining
al tema de desaparición.
related to human trafficking experiences.
¿Hay sanción penal? Sí
So
hay.
there criminal sanctions. Yes, they're established in the penal code or criminal code,
Es muy difícil
but it is very difficult
demostrar, pues, que
to demonstrate that link.
el Ministerio Público, la
Sometimes the prosecutor's office make the effort,
tomos y son procesos que duran
and
años y
the
años.
process that lasts years and years
Crimen organizado, entonces,
because with
sí
organized
sería
crime
tener
efforts.
más
So
fuerza, mayor,
we need to put more
sobre todo
emphasis
tener
and
fiscales
effort and have
policía nacional
prosecutors and national police
dedicada
force that are
a
dedicated
combatir o
to
a
fight
ver estos temas como
this.
en Perú, por ejemplo, hay fiscalías
For
especializadas en
example,
trata y que
in
solamente
Peru,
tienen
we
esta
have
área. Es un
specialized
avance porque
prosecutors office that
sí
only
puede
look at these
ayudarnos
issues
a
that
poder
can help
combatir mejor este tipo
to
de delitos.
do a better fight
Dentro
against this
de
type of crimes.
las recomendaciones, pues,
Among the
todo esto se basa
recommendations,
en la prevención. Entonces, en el tema de
we
prevención,
always have to consider
tenemos que poner
prevention.
también bastante
In
esfuerzo,
prevention, we need to do a lot
sobre
of
todo
effort,
el
especially
tema educativo,
in
porque
terms of
sabemos que a veces
education, because
las
let's
parejas
remember
afectadas por trata justamente
that
son menores de
sometimes
30 años,
trafficking
por parte
disappearances are due to misleading
de
information
trabajo, de necesidad económica,
or economic needs,
pueden
or
presentar
but it's
problemas
mostly
legales.
because
Entonces, la
of
captación
people being
de estas
lied
personas
about.
también
So
se
the
produce
uptake of these victims
porque
is
hay
also
desconocimiento
generated
respecto de cómo operan estas
because of
mafias.
a lack of knowledge of how these
Entonces,
mafias
la prevención
operate. So in terms of
yo creo que
prevention,
donde
I
más
think
tenemos que enfocarnos,
we need to
porque a
focus
pesar no
more
solamente de apagar el
is
fuego,
there because not trying
al hacer los operativos y
of
al resolver
putting
los
out the
casos, sino
fire
también
and rescuing victims, but
evitar
we
que
need to
suceda.
avoid
Entonces, ¿cómo lo hacemos
the
con prevención?
start a fire, and we can do
Por
it
eso
with
podría
prevention.
la
So I think
recomendación
that
para
we could
conseguir la
have
erradicación
the
de este
recommendation
delito y
to eradicate
la trata de
this
personas. Gracias.
human trafficking. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, estimado Johnny Maita.
Thank you, Johnny Maita.
Podemos continuar con Gilberto.
We're going to continue with Gilberto.
No logramos escucharlo.
We cannot hear you.
Creo que hay un problema con el audio.
I think we have an issue with this audio.
Vamos a esperar unos minutos hasta que se solucione.
We will wait.
Por mientras puedo ir dando un pequeño resumen, ¿no? ¿Sí? Ok. Sí lo escuchamos. Adelante.
¿Sí? Go ahead.
Bueno, gracias, qué pena. Y ahorita no me funciona.
My apologies because my video is not working. I'm going to be very brief. For the first question, there are many elements to consider. The priority topic in the health sector is to be the creation of standard mechanisms for response. In Colombia, we have the JUCIA code where these are procedures that the medical staff needs to follow when they see cases of sexual violence. Same should be done for the other cases such as human trafficking. The medical staff must know how to proceed in cases of human trafficking. And what we should not forget is that approach of mental health of the victim. I know that we are in the health environment with physicians and other professionals of health, but we should have, in the health sector, we also have stigmas and stereotypes, and it's very important to approach this type of obstacles that may lead that a woman who's a victim of sexual exploitation be re-victimized because a situation when it's considered that it was her fault. I think that is something that we consider. Now, for the second question, very briefly, the sanctions for those public servants for corruption vary country to country. In most of the countries, it's established as an aggravation for this basic crime, which is trafficking. And the protocol to prevent and sanction is established as an aggravating factor. But I'd like to close with a very strong phrase, and this is something that comes from the spirit of the Convention Against Organized Transnational Organized Crime, and this is corruption oxygenates organized crime. Without corruption and money laundering, the organized crime doesn't have the oxygen, and I consider with Ariadna, the power structures are important because the trafficking of persons and gender-based violence are manifestations of violence and crime that are based on power. The arbitrary use of power, and it's important to combat against it. And a final reflection. When we want to talk about prevention, I agree we need to prevent. But we lost the audio. There are some gender gaps and economic gaps. No matter how much information and symbolisms that we do, if we don't consider these other gaps, we won't get anywhere. And we lost the audio from Gilberto.
Por su
Thank you
respuesta,
for your
Gilberto.
response.
En
So,
base a lo hablado el día de hoy,
based on what we
sus
mentioned
experiencias
today, there are
históricas
actions and
que se
successful
deben evaluar
experiences
para
that are
contribuir
being
a la
evaluated
reducción
to
de las
contribute to the
desigualdades.
reduction
Estas
of
relaciones están muy
missing
relacionadas
persons
con las niñas,
in vulnerable
niños,
populations
hombres,
such as
mujeres,
boys, girls,
adolescentes.
adolescents, and
Sin
women.
embargo, hay un
However,
trabajo por
there's
hacer
still a lot
de
of
una
work to
forma
do
integral,
with a comprehensive
integral
approach with
adaptación
intersectorial
social.
and coordination at every level.
Agradecemos las
We
preguntas
thank
realizadas.
for the
No
questions.
alcanzamos a responderlas todas.
We did not manage to answer them all, but we will take them into account to define topics of the next webinars. To close this space of Q&A, I will ask the three speakers to leave us a final message in less than 1 minute. Gilberto mentioned his message, but you're welcome to give another one. So we will start with Ariadna. Go ahead.
Muchas gracias. Creo que
Thank you.
el mensaje es seguir avanzando en la
The message is to continue working in understanding the relationship between feminicide, human trafficking, and disappearance as extreme gender-based violence and the normalization of deleterious practices. If we all push in this road of understanding and approach and the institutional mechanisms and the data generation and interpretation of data, and in that dialogue with the stakeholders are in constant vigilance on these phenomena in the life of people. But we're making some progress. Thank you. Thank you, dear Ariadna. Johnny, are you still in the room? I think he left. So, once again, thank you to the excellent presentations today, which have been so valuable. We have received many congratulations in social networks. Thank you, Gilberto Zuleta Ibarra. Thank you, Ariadna Reyes and Johnny Maita, for your valuable presentations and your time. To all the participants, to the Horas Conu team, and to all the people who participate in this activity, which has been possible thanks to the commitment to Andean and Latin American integration. Now, Dr. Marisela Malki has the floor for the closing of this webinar on behalf of the Andean Health Organization and Polytechnic Agreement. Go ahead, dear Dr. Malki. Thank you, Danita. Thank you, Rob, for your coordination. First of all, thank our excellent speakers, Ariadna, Tony, Gilberto, who have talked about this topic so concerning and complex that unfortunately is increasing in recent times, much more due to the massive migration we are witnessing in recent years due to internal conflicts, external conflicts, and the climate change, the pandemic that we just through that generated an unprecedented socioeconomic crisis that has generated massive placement of people unprecedented and has put them in a situation of vulnerability, has been taken advantage by those who have some economic power or political power. This is a multidimensional issue, and as it has been mentioned, it needs a multi-sectorial approach involving the civil society with public-private partnerships within the regulations that have involved the law in Peru and how it has changed, agile and dynamic, and that considers the victims that we need to protect, care for. In that regard, they indicate that this approach needs to be focused on victims and that respond to the reality and the context where we live. Although there are common factors, there's singularities in each region, area, and sector. Children and adolescents and women are the most vulnerable group in this problem. You mentioned how important is the data, the information, the statistics. They're not just numbers. They reflect what's going on in the reality and are going to be used to generate policies and to generate strategies to prevent and eradicate. It's important to talk about prevention and not only in terms of responding to the problem, but a lot of emphasis should be done on prevention. And for that, you will show the studies that are being carried out. Knowing that this is a multidimensional topic, a multi-sectorial approach needs to be considered. Please, I'm happy that we consider the economy and finance minister in Peru has been involved in, and they understand they need to guarantee the budget. With no budget, no policy or plan or strategy can be implemented. So in Orascono, we always say, with no budget, there's no rights. Has to be there in the first line. It cannot be forgetting about these problems. The Ministry of Women, the Ministry of Health, many of these institutions are pillars for this effort. The Ministry of the Interior, another important sector, like the prosecutor's office or the court system. So this multi-sectorial approach and the coordination among them is improving, perhaps not at the speed that we would like to see, and to see optimal outcomes and decreasing these numbers that unfortunately are still growing, but at least the road is already there. And I think that we are pushing from where we work. Those of us who have participated here and are represented, and it has to be at all the government levels, at the local, regional, and national, with all the authorities involved. And for us, it is important to continue with putting this issue in agenda so we can continue to discuss it and paying attention and priority for their approach. And perhaps we're going to continue at a different time from another perspective in order to continue generating that interest of each one of the stakeholders work and solve the complex problems. Once again, my thanks to each one of our speakers. Thank those who organized this webinar, Ruby, Danitza, and also Orly. We invite you and to the entire team of the Horas, to all our followers, webinar after webinar, week after week. Since 2020, we are organizing these virtual events. And we invite you for this Thursday. Today was an extraordinary, but this coming Thursday at 11 a.m., the webinar related to challenges in immunizations for children and adolescents. Once again, thank you and see you soon.